All right. Okay. Hi, minasan. Let's begin. Good afternoon. Minasan, konnichiwa. And magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Welcome to the first installment of the lecture series on Filipino-Japanese interpersonal encounters hosted by the Samahan ng mga Pilipinong nag-aral at nanirahan sa Nippon or SAPIL-NIP, which is a member organization of the Philippine Federation of Japan Alumni or PhilFedJa. Okay, so for the opening remarks, may I call on the trustee of SAPIL-NIP and the director of the Nantoku program, Mr. Philip Kisan.
Thank you, Kelly Sensei. I'm very delighted that we are here this afternoon. It's our first installment, as Kelly Sensei said, of a lecture series. So we envision to have a series of lectures on Filipino-Japanese interpersonal interactions. Differentiated from maybe the more esoteric and high-level discussions on politics, economy, and maybe even academe. What we want to do is provide some kind of context and from the prism of interpersonal interactions. Now, this idea came about when my friend here, Gary, my cohort, Dr. Gary Alba, wrote a book about, based on the diary of his father, Mr. Rudy Alba, who wrote this diary in 1943 and 1945 when he was a student in Japan during the war. That group of students, 51 Filipinos and over 200 from the occupied territories, were called the Nampo Tokubetsu Ryugakusei, or the special students from the southern areas. And it so happened my father was also a Nampo Tokubetsu Ryugakusei, or Nantoku for short. And so we had a lot of things in common. And we said, you know, our father's experiences were very different from the common narrative of the war, because not only were they treated very well and they learned a lot of things even during the war, what they learned as young men in wartime conditions actually informed and influenced their lives later on. Many of them imbibing Japanese values in their lifetimes. And so we started dreaming about, you know, if our fathers were lifelong friends, why don't we become friends as well to continue the friendship of families? And then we became more ambitious and said, why is it that nobody really knows much about what happened during the war at the ground level? We always talk about the very big things, and I always remember what he said. The reference of the Nampo Tokubetsu Ryugakusei in Philippine history is one sentence. There were Filipino students who were sent to Japan in 1943, period. But because we grew up with our fathers, we knew that there were many stories. And considering, fast forward to where we are now, how close the relationship between the Philippines and Japan has become, we said, wouldn't it be good to put everything that we enjoy now with Japan in the context of history? Sabi nga ni Rizal, ang hindi marunong lumingon sa kanyang nakaraan ay hindi makakarating sa kanyang paroroonan. Those who do not know how to look to the past will not be able to proceed to the future. And so it is in that light that we decided, why not, under the Samahan ng Pilipinong Nag-aral at Nanirahan sa Nippon, or SAPIL-NIP, which is an organization, member organization of the Philippine Federation of Japan Alumni, why not come up with a series of lectures to frame the context of Philippines-Japan relations based on interpersonal relations and interactions. It is noteworthy that the Philippines-Japan Society, which is our place now, Philippines-Japan Friendship Foundation, including many of the member organizations in the Economic Cooperation Committee, the Philippine Federation of Japan Alumni. Many of these were actually organized by that group, the Nampo Tokubetsu Ryugakusei from the Philippines. And so we wonder, why did they have so much invested in Philippines-Japan relations? You know, they were there during the war. Why did they want closer, friendly, peaceful, harmonious relations with the Japanese? So maybe to understand that, let's go back in history. And we are so fortunate that we have with us our guest lecturer, who is an expert. I think we will all be able to see why he is an expert on the topic. But to begin a series of lectures which we are planning to hold next year and subsequent periods, we have been blessed to have our lecturer kick off this lecture series. So with that, I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for your interest in this. And we would like to acknowledge the Philippines-Japan Friendship Foundation for allowing us the use of these premises. And we hope that we will continue to see all of you in our future lectures. Thank you very much. Again, welcome to everyone, and let us all enjoy today's lecture.
Thank you, Sir Philip. Okay, so next, to introduce our guest speaker for today, I would now like to turn the floor over to a non-toku descendant, Mr. Gary Alba.
Good afternoon, everyone. Gary Alba. And just like Philip said, our fathers were together in Japan during the war in 1943. Anyway, I was going to introduce our esteemed speaker. If I talked about his accomplishments, I would take up all of the time of the entire lecture. But anyway, our speaker is a Filipino. Don't get fooled by the name. He's Roman Catholic and speaks 5 languages. Of course, English, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, and Hiligaynon. So he from Filipino, from Paro. He is currently professorial lecturer at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, at the Asian Center. He is also a part-time lecturer at the LaSalle College of Arts in Singapore, Putnam School of Film and Animation, so manga. Okay. He is also a part-time lecturer from 2016 to the present at Fukuoka Women's University. Before, from 2013 to 2020, he was director of the Japanese Studies Program of Ateneo de Manila University. From 2010 to 2022, he was Department of History School of Social Sciences Assistant Professor, Ateneo de Manila University. And in 2018 and in 2022, he was a visiting professor of Hitotsubashi University. So without further ado, may I welcome our esteemed lecturer, Professor Carl Ian Uy Cheng Jua from Asia.
So first and foremost, I'm very grateful and humbled to actually begin the lecture series, considering that there are far more other people than me to do this. But I also appreciate it because it also shows the appreciation of this organization, as what Gary had already described. My entire career is actually looking at Japan. with the Philippine lens, which usually is a very different angle from most of my contemporaries and even my predecessors who look at the Philippines with Japan at the same time. And hence, just a background to what I'm going to present. This was commissioned to me by the German Institute of Japanese Studies in Sofia University to commemorate the promulgation, the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Constitution. In 2018, the Japan commemorated the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, the government, and the Germans did not want to celebrate it with everyone else. So we did a separate category for this. And a good friend of mine gathered a lot of people to do this talk, but he also wanted to shift things by saying, "Oh, why don't we have non-Japan lenses to this conference?" And hence, they brought it to me, who doesn't know much about Philippine history. And I was now struggling in this case because, as what most of you have encountered, we tend to think that the Japanese interactions with the Philippines would only be a little before the war, but not actually as early as the 19th century. Right? And so that was the exploration that I sort of did. I like to chat, as you can see, so I'd rather read a little bit, but I also put some things in between. So the year 2018 marked a significant event commemorating the 150th anniversary of Meiji Restoration. Despite this, what becomes interesting is that a small-scale ceremony at the Parliamentary Museum was held with no member of the imperial family attending. It becomes an interesting concept for me. A common theme for remembering the Meiji era in Japan is its entry towards modernity, something that we have to think about, right? That Meiji was the time that Japan becomes modern. To which the then Prime Minister Abe stated that we will follow in Meiji people's footsteps and open the way to a new era following Heisei. So the idea here was really the theme of Meiji as the path towards modernity of Japan. Anyway, again, great. So just a couple of dates there, and incidentally, to those who are interested and to those who are historiophiles, the Meiji Constitution is accessible thanks to the digital movement of the National Diet Library. So we could sort of click it, but we can't hurt us. It's okay. And it becomes interesting in terms of looking at the words that are there. So there is no question to the success of the propagation of this myth, and that's where I'm going to work with, particularly in its afterlives, with historians and scholars praising Meiji's modernity. Did such image resonate to other countries beyond Japan? That is my concept. The late Qing, Siam Dynasty, Siam monarchy, Ethiopia, Poland, and even the Philippines concurred. The Meiji era was from October 23, 1968, which marked the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, up to July 30, 1912, with the death of the emperor. This will be important because we will now be comparing to the Philippines. On the Philippines, on the other hand, it was a period of flux, where they're not going to be perfect to each other. 1868 marked the 300th year of Spanish colonial rule, di pa tapos, for the Philippines, while 1912 was a period when the country was normalizing after the Americans took control. So we are in this odd state with them. Took control of her as a new colonial acquisition in 1898. Nonetheless, there is serendipity in these watersheds from a global scale, as unknown to the Filipinos. In September 19 to 27, 1868, La Gloriosa, the Glorious Revolution, was occurring in Spain, which resulted in the weakening of the Spanish government and eventually the repercussions to its colonies. So in other words, there is that narrative that that the Filipinos kind of won because of our strength, but there's also this serendipitous event that the Spanish crown was already weakening, and hence it could have been an opportunity for us, right? For their states that the crisis in Spain in the Spanish colonial model coincided with the end to almost a century of political stability in Spain, which marked time for fundamental change in the relationship between Philippine society and Spanish colonial dominion. On the other hand, if we go now to the end, 1912 was also pivotal as Woodrow Wilson, in his election campaign in the United States, encouraged the drafting of the Jones Act, better known as the Philippine Autonomy Act, which provided the framework for a more autonomous government for the Philippines, with the condition that a stable local government has to be established. Right? So I'm sort of setting that up within these lines. So from a history thing, historians have to contextualize our concepts. So where are we now? The Philippine revolutionaries, who were predominantly coming from elite households, I have to emphasize this, looked at the modernization of the Meiji government and its development as a model for their own eventual independent government. What these revolutionaries were keen on was the promulgation of the Meiji Constitution, and that was where I wanted to work with. Yes, promulgation of Meiji Constitution, which not only created a local government via the parliamentary system, but also updated their judiciary, implemented a universal educational system, restructured the national and local bureaucracies. In other words, these were things that the Filipino revolutionaries wanted, right? But they were now trying to look for structures. And of course, during this time, you had now the option of choosing the European models, right? Who had their established constitution, or were you going to take a chance with a new modern nation, which is Meiji, right? And that was what part of the attraction of the revolutionaries to the Meiji Constitution. Furthermore, the modern constitution was able to define citizenship and obligation. So why the Germans were insisting on us celebrating the Constitution is because without the Constitution, we wouldn't even have identified ourselves as Filipino, right? Because it defines who citizens are and so on. But don't worry, because it's not a good constitution. Because women were not seen as citizens in that constitution yet. But these are things that we have to sort of understand, and that's why part of what I wanted to show the Meiji Constitution, which you could access, is it begins with the emperor, which becomes an interesting model, and then it ends with how do you define now the Japanese subjects under the emperor, right? So with that. Such features became attractive to Filipinos whose pleas for independence fell on the deaf ears of both the Spanish colonial government and the American occupiers, right? Ay, nawala. Hello. I think, no.
Change.
I like it.
Pahinga.
Hello. Ayun, thank you. So take note that there was an effort from the revolutionaries to always ask for independence, right? Sometimes it was a compromise where we're dealing with either, we want to be a state of the Spain or we want to be a state of the US, but there was always going to be that compromise that came about. Nonetheless, as we know from our histories, it didn't happen, right? And that was why the Japan model was actually quite attractive to them. There might have been some sincerity from the revolutionaries attracted to the Meiji model. But with the dominance of Philippine elites in government positions in post-independence Philippines, I posit, and from my research, the motive can be similar to the Chinese and the Thai governments, where it's the unfortunate state of them, people in power just wanting to stay in power, right? Elites wanting to protect their positions. And when we think about it, the Meiji Constitution was also constructed in the same model, right? Within that space, right? And they were attracted to this, particularly when you look at the example of the Siam monarch Chulalongkorn, who allowed for both a legitimate, one of its legitimate reasons was, okay, we want this because we want modernity. That was that was what they were selling. That was what Meiji government was also selling to its own people. Right? Philippine historians observed that some Filipinos chose Japan as a country that they wanted to live, study, and seek political support from, particularly during the Philippine Revolution against the Spanish. Right? Of course, we cannot avoid the fact that Jose Rizal was actually in Japan during that time. He was national hero Jose Rizal, who transferred via Japan from February 28 to 13 April 1888 on his way to Europe. Rizal was very impressed with Japan and the Japanese people as he experienced development. He would write it in his diary, and if you want to, I think Ambeto Campo has written so much about this in his public pieces. There. Development in the Meiji period. In a letter to his family in the Philippines, Rizal wrote, "There were very few thieves among the Japanese. It is said that the houses are permanently unlocked. The walls were made of paper, and in the hotels, one can, in tranquility, leave money on your table." But it also gives you this very bad situation, like, so what was happening in the Philippines in that time for Rizal to actually write such a thing, right? But it's an interesting reflection, which reflected his awe on the people and the country. The impression made him begin studying the language. You will see. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find my own place. He would do sketches, and he would attempt to write in kanji and hiragana katakana. It's awful, but what can you do with the national hero? So, but I think it's accessible as well. And in some of Ambeto Campos' articles, he would show these images as well, right? As well as illustrations of his observations of the country through various scenes in Japan. Finally, of course, we cannot ignore the thing on the table where he had a Japanese girlfriend. Of course, it's always going to be part of his story, right? Finally, he would have a brief relationship, sad, such a man, right? With a Japanese lady named Usui Seiko, daughter of a samurai family. And the grave is in Ikebukuro. So, and it's part of the youth district. So, wow. Rizal celebrating his youth with a woman, and we're going to remember that. It's there. Rizal's observation parallels a lot of other nations, particularly in the 20th century. Independence thinkers in Poland have also echoed the same stereotypes in their writing. So it's not just unique to the Philippines itself. Another thing would be La Solidaridad, the official newspaper of the liberal Filipino reform movement, called the Propaganda, was invested in the developments of Meiji Japan, that it published articles concerning Meiji government policies, Meiji government policies, Spanish-Japanese trade, biographies of Japanese generals. Right? There was even articles referencing Japanese citizens expressing their support to the revolutionary movement. So in other words, it wasn't just a unilateral thing where we Filipinos were in awe of modern Japan. The Japanese were also looking at the Philippines. And of course, because they were a democracy, however, what democracy was during that time, they were also trying to push the Meiji government to why don't you support the revolution, right? In an article which you can access by LaSalle scholars Maligaya, Mamaradjo, and Demetrio, they have recorded a total of 43 articles in the periodical La Solidaridad, referring to Japan in its history of 160 issues. In one article written by revolutionary Marcelo H. Del Pilar, he opined that the fear of Spain vis-a-vis Japan as the former, there is a fear of Spain to Japan as the former recognized how inferior and oppressive the colonial policies were to the Philippines. So you now have Marcelo Del Pilar saying like, oh, but it's also bad because he was saying that, oh, look at Spain, look at how awful they're treating the Philippines. Look at Japan, and look how good they were treating Korea and Taiwan, which are all colonial subjects as well. But quite funny. Quite funny in the sense that Del Pilar was looking at this tragic situation and saying that, they're better off despite the fact that they're both colonial subjects, right? In relation to Korea and Taiwan. In another article published that the Japanese citizen, in another article, one Filipino actually retorted to Rizal, saying that Japanese citizens were by nature untidy and lazy, but through the rigorous education that they received based on their constitution, their undesirable traits were disappearing. So parang he was also looking at this idea that everyone's the same, but you can change with order. Wow, right? The Meiji order during this time. One of the oft-repeated myths of Japanese interest of support to the Philippine Revolution was a purported meeting between revolutionary forces with dignitaries representing the Meiji government aboard the Japanese training cruiser Congo.
Next slide.
Yeah. Training cruise Congo, right? Which coincidentally entered Manila Bay in 1896. A couple of months prior to the advent of the anti-Spanish Revolution. You will see a lot of this more from Dr. Jose. It's surprising. We both wrote at the same time with different projects, but he's focused mainly on this. And basically what I'm doing is saying, no. But anyway, it's, I love him, but I have to write my own thing. So the meeting was mediated by a Japanese merchant, Tagawa Moritaro, which resulted in a purported written agreement where the revolutionaries would raise 500,000 pesos for the purchase of 100,000 rifles, 150 cannons, and ammunition. However, I would think that this is a myth concerning the meeting because the only sources, as even Dr. Jose has written, were only from the Philippine sources. And if you think about it from a historical lens, Japanese are usually very meticulous record keepers. So even whatever they're spending wherever they go, but try to look for it. There are no written records, but there can be two possible things about this. I'm doing the evil one, which is the Filipinos are lying. But the other thing could be the sensitivity of the nature of their meeting as well. But I have not yet pushed that because that would mean that I have to find more sources. So I'm still working with the idea that it's a myth. I'm not going to say lie. At least it's sexy to say myth, right? For this. However, there was no record. However, another notable figure. Next slide, please. Another notable figure, which we cannot ignore, especially in Philippine-Japan relations, would be figures that were exiled in Japan, including Artemio Ricarte, a general of the anti-Spanish Revolution, who opted for a life in Japan rather than pledge an oath of allegiance to the United States. With his wife and family, he finally situated in Yokohama sometime in 1910. Aside from making a living teaching Spanish, they opened their famous small coffee shop, Karihan Luvimin, which entertained not only Filipino travelers passing through Japan, but as well as Pan-Asianist groups. Pan-Asianist groups in the region, so Taiwan, India, and so on. So they gathered in that space. It becomes an important ground for people to have evil thoughts and evil plans within this space. But for the Japanese side as well, what becomes interesting is it also was an attractive ground for shishi. To those who are not familiar with it, they are a hyper-revolutionary group within Japan itself. So it becomes this interesting mix of people that are now meeting in Ricarte's small coffee shop, right? Just to give you an idea, Filipino travelers were made aware of Ricardo's presence due to the familiarity of the name of his cafe. So in other words, not a lot of Filipinos knew that Ricarte was exiled in Yokohama, but the moment that they say, "Oh, why don't you eat at Lubi Min?" What is that Japanese word? It's Filipino, so they sort of popped in and talked to him, right? Um, Ricarte, through his cafe, became a compact zone for ideas with the likes such as Sun Yat-sen, Rash Behari Bose, and members of the another infamous group, Hokuryukai, like Mitsuru Toyama and Aizo Soma. So, in other words, they were really like plotting things within this space. And that becomes interesting. With the influx of Asian exiles passing through Japan, the Shishi were now more aware of the plight and the plight of the Asians who were seeking independence against European, with the Philippines American, imperialism. So our independence was not just against, we were not just working on our own, we were also working with all the Asians that were wanting their own independence during this time. Most of the people who engaged in such contact zones were Asians seeking for an alternative Asian model of modernity, which is similar to the reactions of the Africans as well. Why was Japan now attractive? Not only was it an Asian modernity, but to some extent, it's curious to them. The Ethiopian intellectuals were attracted to Meiji modernity because it was non-Christian and non-white. So it was really fighting within this idea that we cannot trust another white American, white European model. So why not? Let's throw our eggs into the Japan basket. Right? But we know what's going to happen in the 1940s. So that's things that's going to happen. While the previously mentioned individuals looked for to the newly modernized Meiji government with their own volition, the succeeding individuals, in other words, there was not yet a lot of interactions that were happening. They were just talking. They were just interacting with each other. Next slide. The succeeding individuals actively sought government interventions from Japan in their dream to liberate the Philippines from the United States. General Emilio Aguinaldo, president of the First Philippine Republic, was inclined towards Japan. Which he considered the Messiah. That becomes interesting because he uses Christian terms, right? And he often writes it in his pieces. From the oppressed races in Asia that were under the control of the white races. Wow. There was a reason, and this was the reason why he sent Mariano Ponce, Jose Alejandrino, and Fausto Licauco to Japan to ask Japan to recognize the First Philippine Republic and its independence. So it becomes curious in a sense that when Aguinaldo declared his independence, one of the first countries that they wanted recognition from was Japan. But the story will not be as beautiful as we'd like it to be, right? Another revolutionary, next slide. Yes, another revolutionary, Jose Ramos, fled and lived in Japan from 1895 to 1900. He studied Japanese language and became an interpreter for fellow Filipino revolutionaries who came to Japan to seek some form of assistance for the revolution and independence. So it's sort of like this group of people that's just here, where they needed a contact zone with Japan themselves. With what the revolutionaries perceived as the betrayal of the Americas through the acquisition of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, the Philippines was once again fighting for its independence. Ramos was able to assist Ponce by liaising with him with the Japanese Shishi through the assistance of Sun Yat-sen. And this is what they got, right? They were able to act, and this is the real one, not the previous myth. So there were two arrangements. This is the only thing that happened, and there is a document that agrees with this. What did they get from? What did they get from the Japanese? 10,000 Murata rifles, 6 million rounds of ammunition, one fixed cannon, 10 field guns, 7 field glasses, one pressing machine for gunpowder, and materials for ammunition. So in other words, this is the first time that officially it's not the Japanese government, but Japanese citizens who had tried to support the war itself. Unfortunately, the support would not reach the Philippines as it sank near the Saddle Islands off the coast of Shanghai. So so it's sad, but at least it was something that is celebrated by the revolutionaries. Like, hooray for the non-help that Japan has given us, because it's all there. Right? What the Filipino revolutionaries were not, although I will sort of turn it in this, what the revolutionaries were not aware of is that the new Meiji government was not unified in their policies towards Asia. So the idea here is if you study the Japanese government, we think that the Meiji government was actually clean. But the reality is it was also in a mess on its own because it's a newly institutionalized government. The newly institutionalized government and the Navy were preferring an American annexation of the Philippines. Sad, right? Hence resulted in their lukewarm responses to the pleas of the Filipino revolutionaries. Remember Mariano Lichauco and so on? They were actually turned away because of this, right? So there was this power play that was happening, and unfortunately, the Japanese government was still cautious with their interactions with the Americans. In a telegram by then Foreign Minister Aoki Shuzo transmitted to the Minister of Japan in Washington, he writes offering to work with the Americans in managing the Philippines, saying that if the United States did not annex the Philippines, Japan would be happy as a voice of determining the status of the islands. Wow, diba? And Japan is willing to share in the responsibilities of governing the Philippines if the American government so desires. So in other words, one part of this is we tend to think that the intentions of the Japanese only came in 1940s, but the reality is they already had something there since the 19th century. But we don't know to what extent it was going to be, because this did not happen, right? That was why the 1896 Philippine Revolution proceeded without official Japanese government assistance. Take note, what I mean by this is the actual Japanese government assisting, meaning Japan, the Meiji government declares that yes, we are supporting the Philippine government and we want their liberation. But what you will see in a lot of examples are individuals in the Japanese government that had their own support to the Philippines. Nonetheless, this setback did not prevent the headquarters of the Katipunan, another revolutionary group, from transmitting a myth or lie to their branch heads that the warships from Japan were sent to assist the revolution. And the only reason they needed to do this was to uplift the morale of the revolutionaries, right? So it becomes this interesting pick-me-up that, oh, we're losing, and the only way that they could sort of calm the people is like, oh, the Japanese are coming to help us. Well, they do in 1940s, but in a different way, right? So it becomes this interesting concept. Right. Furthermore, the diplomatic party of Ponce, Alejandrino, and Lichauco were refused diplomatic recognition and military acceptance for the Philippine-American War. So that was the rejection. And thus, the reason for such a response was Japan's need for U.S. non-intervention in the Sino-Japanese War. Because it was also happening there, and that was part of their caution. Despite these disappointments, I'm not painting a bad picture, I'm painting a holistic picture. The myth of Meiji modernity still existed, with a report from the Japanese consul, Misu, at Manila, quoting a Philippine revolutionary. So the consul Misu was actually giving a lot of information to Japan, where one of the Philippine revolutionaries said, "We wish for independence under Japanese protection." So the Katipuneros wanted this. But it was very regrettable that and a pity that Japan, being such a great country in Asia, did not assist our independence war. We understood that Japan faced a very difficult situation, but as a powerful Asian nation, Japan had power and we expected Japanese assistance. So even up to the very end, they really wanted to believe that Japan was going to help them, even if they were betrayed. But life. This disappointed the Japanese army, and especially the Shishi, that were influenced by Pan-Asianist thought that was happening during this period, and wished to foster Asian brotherhood, justice, liberty, and independence in Asia under the leadership of Japan. Nonetheless, with individual capacities did exist in the revolution. The influx of such soldiers, such as dispatching Captain Sakamoto Hiro of the Japanese army in Taiwan, he was in Taiwan, to attend the meetings of the Katipunan, continued to bolster confidences of the Philippine revolutionaries to Japan. Just to have a Japanese face within their spaces made them sort of say like, okay, Japan is still helping us. Yeah. Okay. So that's one part. So that's where the revolution comes into the picture. Right? The next one is this section, Meiji poverty. So on the one hand, I'm sort of talking to Sir Rico Jose and his revolutionary narrative and saying that it's not necessarily while we did support while the Philippine revolutionaries were looking to Japan, unfortunately Japan was not fully fledged in helping us. So the next part of this, for me, which is part of what I did most of the work, was to actually look at was Meiji really a modern nation, right? Particularly when it was new. It is unquestionable that the phenomena of Meiji modernization did exist. One must understand that such marvels were able to succeed through the roles performed by Japan's massive underclass. So in other words, what you will see in Meiji period is typical of wealthy nations where the gap between the rich and the poor was quite big. And what Rizal and all of these elites were seeing as Japan were actually built on the backs of the Meiji poor. The urban poor of the late Meiji years performed most of the tasks that made Japan's modern transformation possible. They turned out factory goods that clothed the people and propelled Japan into an international market. They built Ginza's brick town and Osaka's 250-foot Tsutentaku. Nawawala na. Hello. Tsutentaku Tower. They wala. No worries. Hello. Ayan. They prevented epidemics. They prevented epidemics by removing human feces from the cities. They pulled rickshaws that got people from work and play. If Meiji modernity was a cacophony, the urban poor made it so. So in other words, the only reason I add to this picture is the idea that we cannot assume that Meiji was actually a perfect institution, but also had all of its own internal problems, to which the Filipino revolutionaries were not sort of able to see. Other examples that you have there include, I have there like what we think as modernity, and hence my comment that Meiji women were not recognized as citizens, right? It was only until 1947, so past Meiji, that they were recognized as people who had the right to vote. That's one problem. The other thing is that they removed the idea of why I also emphasize the idea of the Constitution, because the sad thing is the Meiji Constitution also determines who are people, not citizens, who are people. And that's why you have that new category of hinin, which it's supposed to be social outcasts. But even from the term itself, it just means non-human. Right? which they just repackaged as Shin Heimin, new citizens. Think of this, if you're familiar with Indian history, this is also the same way that the untouchables were then renamed as, relabeled as different. So, hooray. So we have all of those types of concepts. All right, so where am I now working with this? Next slide, please. Yeah. Oh, sorry. The one before it, please. I think we pushed. Yeah. Where am I working with this? Labor migration was labor migration for, I think you, no worries. Before this.
Canaan Road.
Yeah, the Cannon Road one. Yeah. All right. Where am I now working with? So this is what I'm going to be working with. It's a myth that is created by. It was a myth created by both the Japanese government and the Philippine history, right? Within this picture. So labor migration was made complicated during the Meiji period with the implementation of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So it's not just us. Remember, in our own Philippine history, America was actually a labor migration place. A lot of probably your parents also went, who now or grandfathers who went to the U.S. This was the it's okay. This was the time when they actually moved to that place, but because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's okay. Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, people trying to determine who is Chinese and who is not, and everyone was now seen as Chinese. So Japanese, Filipinos, Chinese, everyone was excluded. So they needed a place to look for. And needed a new place for migration. And one of those places is, of course, the new American colonial space of the Philippines, because it's an America, but not, right? During that time. The other one would be Hawaii, the America, well, sort of America, closer America than the Philippines itself. While the Japanese were interested in working in Hawaii, they were limited from entry, hence tried to find a roundabout path, which included passing through the Philippines. So we became the place that legit them, and so that they can then go to Hawaii. Right? The American colonial government was in need of unskilled labor for their new infrastructure projects with their new colonial space, and thus a compromise of interpreting the act was to simply limit the number of labor migrants based on demand. So in other words, you don't say no, you say, okay, we'll just open 3, 4, 5, 10, 1,000 and so on. But it was only for the Philippines itself. From the Japanese government side, they regulated the number of unskilled labor migrants by reminding the shipping companies that no more than 100 laborers per ship should enter and be allowed to depart for the Philippines, to not arouse suspicions of migration officers who implemented the Exclusion Act. So in other words, what becomes interesting here is the Japanese government, surprising now because we have this problem now. The Japanese government were in cahoots with their citizens to illegally ship Japanese people to the Philippines. But they limited it to 100 because if this was more than 100, the POEA in the Philippines is going to say like, no, you cannot enter because this is illegal for the Philippines, right? While some Japanese made low-risk choices to work in the cities, so that's where Meiji poverty comes in. There were some Japanese people that just chose like, okay, let's just go to Tokyo, let's just go to Osaka. We're not gonna be paid well, fine, because we're afraid to go somewhere else. Others opted to take a larger risk and traveled overseas. There are two distinct economic migrations that I will be working with, the laborers and Karayuki-san. This highlights the myth of Meiji modernity, the effects which focus primarily on the cities, as reflected in the economic migration of the rural poor. So this means that for Filipinos who encountered and interacted with such that it should be impossible for Filipinos to not interact with these economic refugees because they were there. But part of what I wanted to present is probably this was not in the purview of our revolutionaries, because our revolutionaries were rich and they don't want to talk to the yayas and to the drivers during that time, right? Um, Nonetheless, Japanese migrant population in the Philippines was the largest in Southeast Asia. The ignorance of the Philippine revolutionaries of the period towards this can be understood by the fact that they were actually elites who were not encountering the lowly Japanese labor migrants. Right? Philippine historians would write about the revolution would often categorize as nationalist historians. According to Claudio, oh, okay, no, I don't want to go to theory because it's going to be a let's just work with the stories. So labor migration one cannot afford the labor migration that helped in building Cannon Road, a two-lane 45-kilometer road connecting the mountains of Baguio with the lowland town of Rosario in La Union. Right? The project began in 1903 and was used in 1905. Several accounts highlight the presence of American colonial engineers for Japanese labor who came from peasant families in the provinces where the new Meiji law, land taxation, caused extreme poverty. In other words, part of the reason that the Japanese were coming here was because the new laws were now shifting the economic lives of the Japanese themselves. They could not afford to pay by currency because they were paying in labor. So the one way for them to escape this was to escape Japan itself. And they came to the Philippines where they're going to earn a lot of money. Right? Goodman identified that the first large group of Japanese would come from Okinawa and were preferred due to the negative impressions left towards colonial masters with the reluctance of Filipino laborers. The lazy Filipino myth that was there. So the idea here was building on the reputation of the Japanese laborers who are supposed to be good, good strong laborers. They don't complain a lot. Vis-a-vis the myth of the lazy native, the Filipinos. Just to add, some of the other laborers that were recorded were coming from the farming villages of Hiroshima, Fukuoka, Fukushima, Kumamoto, and Nagasaki. So if you look at the list of places where they come from, these are not the centers. So in other words, like in any type of nation, it's people from the peripheries where things that are happening in the centers would not affect them that much. So it's sort of like in Manila where all the wealth, all the cosmopolitanism is happening. But when you then go far away from Manila, right, this wealth is not permeated to them. So that's why they move elsewhere. Okay? Was there really a preference to Japanese laborers? Not really. As an account would mention, the labor migrants were merely supplementary to the local Filipino laborers contracted as colonial subjects by the Americans. Migrant Chinese laborers were also present, but were observed to be mostly heroin addicts and deemed to be unreliable. So the cheaper ones would be the Chinese, the next ones would be the Filipinos, and then slightly expensive were the Japanese. But why would you say that? Why would you say that there is now this myth of the misconstruction of the Japanese laborers? The problem here is that you're now looking at non-cosmopolitan, non-sophisticated Japanese that are now moving into a terribly tropical country. And that was why a lot of Japanese laborers actually perished from illness. So they were actually not reliable at all. Because at the moment that they come to us, they're dead. Or some of them were not. Some of them were not going to survive. As records reported in health records, 200 labor migrants died due to, among other things, dysentery, beriberi, and malaria. Things that we were, tropical people were used to this. Mosquitoes, and so on. And hence, why there was now a surge of Japanese labor migrants was to just supplement the people that were dying within these spaces. It's sad. I know I shouldn't be laughing, but it's just funny in the historian's head right now. Considering that the conditions were unattractive and unsafe, as judged by the Filipino labor. So in other words, this is also contrary to the other myth. Why are the Filipino laborers here not working? Why were they lazy? Because they knew that the Americans have unsafe conditions for the building of Cannon Road. And it was really an interesting thing, an agency of the Filipinos to make that choice. No, we don't want to. I said, yeah, right? But for the Japanese who are not familiar with our environment, they were unfortunately going into this with the hopes that after they get to this, they can now get a ticket to either go to Hawaii or maybe to the mainland, right? Within this picture. So on the one end, what we have here is a story of the sad situations of the Japanese labor migrants. Next slide, please. Where they not only have now built lives for themselves, but it was a tentative and a temporal life because remember they're coming here through they are coming here through the projects that were given to them by the American colonial leaders. So much so that after when the Cannon Road was then finally constructed, the last some of them who were lucky enough to get contracts would then move to Davao for the abaca plantations, if they were lucky, right? Because the conditions of their contract is after they finish Cannon Road, they have to then return back to Japan because of the Exclusion Acts. In this situation, what then eventually happens is you now have the interstate mixing that's happening. Because of course, these people would not want to go home, so they marry. They would either take on a Filipino wife, or they now move down to Davao. And you will have a couple of breaks in between. Some of them would now be in Iloilo, some of them would also go to Cebu, but they're very small in between. But what is now my emphasis here? My emphasis here is yes, they exist. They're actually part of our histories. But what a lot of Philippine history does not tell us is that the Japanese are here because of Japan's poverty, right? So the idea that the idea that the elites were actually selling the myth of Meiji as this wealthy modern nation, and yet we are able to see some of the Meiji subjects flowing out of that country tells you that it was a myth on its own, which then gives us a more sadder picture with the second people. Next slide, please. Which to me is much more fascinating. Karayuki-san, right? Who are Karayuki-san? Karayuki-san are basically Japanese women, particularly from the provinces that would now be sold by their families to engage in sex work. The difference here is that Meiji government had legitimized prostitution, but the legitimacy of prostitution was only limited to the red light districts, and that's why that's why we have that type of phrase that they are only allowed to operate in a certain section. While there was a certain group of prostitutes in Japan that were able to live their lives in Japan itself, Karayuki-san are different in the sense that they had to be shipped outside of Japan. So think of it in the same way as the 80s, 90s, when a lot of women also sought a lot of women from third world countries are now going to first world countries to actually do sexual labor, right? And Japan was also part of it in the 19th century. So what we see here is a reflection of this poverty. A lot of them, because they did not earn income, not only that, a lot of them were not considered citizens and subjects of Japan in itself, had no agency. And the only way for them to actually earn money was to then go to these different countries. The sad situation with the happy situation, but the sad situation for the Philippines is that we were probably going to be destination 2 or destination 3 for Karayuki-san, for Japanese. And what does that mean? In other words, we're probably the second country that they will then find work, which means that they're less sick than if they're in the country 3 and 4. Particularly since sexually transmitted sexual STDs was actually a very problematic period during this time. The first will always be either China, that's what Karayuki-san is named for, or it's either China, particularly Shanghai, or Taiwan, I'm not really sure. But a pleasant thing here is that Singapore and Malaysia will be destination 4 or 5. And that's where you then see that by the time the Japanese prostitutes go to them, these are really incredibly sick and incredibly weak women, which also then tells you about the economic condition of how they're now choosing their countries. So us being two tells you that the Philippines was a very good place economically. But why am I actually talking to you about this? Prostitution, I mean, sure, we're now in the stage where women's agency for their bodies is supposed to be a modern thing. But during this time, what it meant was that the women did not have any place for occupations within their own countries, which then tells you about how is this modern nation now able to survive within this place, right? And at the same time, Philippines, remember, was a very Christian Catholic, Catholic and Christian country because the Americans are now here, right? They were allowing this so much so that I think in one of the readings, one of the articles, there was already a poem in Filipino that was talking about the Karayuki-san in the sky. Allow me to read it. Ako ay hindi si Remedios, ako ay hindi si Chayong. Ang damit kong suot, iba na sa ngayon. Damit na bagong galing sa Hapon. Ako'y Haponesa, taga-ibang bayan. At sa bali-balik na ay naninirahan. Uupo sa silya, laging nakadungaw. At Amerikano ay siyang inaantay. Halina, tayo'y magblangketa, maglagay ng pula sa dalawang pisngi. Saka magpupusod ng pusod ng bakli. Lagay ng ipit ang buong panahid. Okay. So in other words, we cannot also say that in the Philippine case that these women were not seen by the Filipinos because they were writing about them. But why were they allowed in the Philippines? Number one, I mean, it also becomes sad as a Japanese studies scholar in the Philippines. So the only reason they were allowed to exist in the Philippines was because the American colonial government was saying, if we don't allow these women to do their services in the Philippines, then they will take their natives. They will then go to the Filipino women. Because sexual services was actually supposed to be part of the thing. And for the American colonial government, if Americans now touch Filipino women, it's going to make the Filipinos angry, right? And revolution and all that bad things is going to happen. So might as well, persecute a different type of women from a different country to do so, right? The other thing is, of course, we're also looking at it from a health issue. The nice thing with a country that has approved sexual services, which in other words that it's illegal, meant that they were also careful with the sexual health of these women in Japan. So in other words, there is the perception of these women as being cleaner than the rest of the prostitutes that were actually functioning within these spaces in Southeast Asia itself. So, and that's why they actually, had a large, income. During this time, the only numbers that I was able to get here is in Davao, where a monthly salary of a Karayuki-san is around 200 to 300 pesos, versus, and this is 19th century, so like, wow, right? Yeah. But if you then compare it to a Filipina, prostitute during this time, her monthly salary was she would be lucky if she would get around 10 pesos. Right? So you can also see that disparities that is there, but nonetheless, I'm looking at it from the idea of the poverty that they're working with in this space. Right? So with all of this, what am I now working with? How am I now tying this all together? I'm not actually pursuing anything new here. These are all part of Philippine history. We know about the stories of our revolution. We know about the stories of Cannon Road itself. But what is now interesting for me, which is for this organization, is the idea that the Filipinos were actually functioning within the idea that Japan was this great nation during that time that was going to save us, right? Without realizing, and this is not criticizing Japan itself, that Japan was basically normal, right? The myth that was created during that time was actually a way for us to look at them. But the reality is we're now able to see the human side of things. We're able to see that there were also Japanese laborers that were coming into our spaces. There were also Japanese women that were engaging in these sexual services that were here. In the same way that we were also sending our labor to the US during this time, and we were also sending our women and our labor in a different space. Right? So it's just realigning this idea of history itself. And by doing so, what I'd like to work with is, as a conclusion during that time, is because it was supposed to be a constitutional concept. My conclusion to that paper was we have to then look at the concept of our laws, right? But for this talk, my conclusion basically is well, Philippine scholars in history of history writing about Philippine-Japan relations during the Meiji period would undeniably write about how some Filipino revolutions look at Japan as a model, which saved the Philippines. But what we have to then understand here is that model, if we then position it within our own histories with Japan, that model was a myth in its creation. And what that tells you is we can play with myths in the same way that we're presently playing with another myth with our own elections. And hopefully we're able to engage in this type of conversations. I hope that sort of makes sense, and I think I'll end this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chua. So the floor is now open for the question and answer. Sorry for the mic, no, it's not working. Right, so do we have any questions from the on-site attendees or maybe from online? Or even if it's not a question, comments,
Questions, and
reaction, even if they are violent reactions.
yeah.
Right, anybody?
Can I ask a question? This period of Cannon Road all the way to the migration was roughly up to what year was that?
I limited myself to Meiji, so that means it's from early 1888 to 1912. Because I think if we push the slide further, one of the requests of the group was also to look at Davao. The problem is Davao is now actually 1920s to 1930s when the Japanese moved there. But if you go to the last slide, I actually have data on the Davao people, just for people to know that you now see the movement of the Japanese to Davao, and I didn't want to deal with this because Davao has its own history altogether. And the interactions of the Davao Japanese is going to be fascinating because a lot of them would actually marry, they would marry indigenous people, as opposed to their interactions in Luzon. Okay, it was sort of, for me as a story, it's going to make it more confusing. But yeah, next.
So by 1939, Japanese accounted for about 6% of the population of Davao. Considering that at the start of the century there was none.
Yeah, so because by that time, I mean, they're all in Manila, or they're all 1903 and so on. They're still building in Cannon Road. And the only time that they trickled down was when their contracts end. Oh, incidentally, I haven't been to Baguio, but all of the but there are 3 camps that are in Davao. Were also built by them. So after Cannon Road was built, the 3 camps, they would now open contracts for the Japanese laborers to stay and build the 3 camps at Jamhe, whatever, and so on. And once that ends, that's when they go down. Or if they're not able to get their contracts, then they're forced to repatriate. So even this number that you see in Davao is just a very small portion of the actual migrants that are in the.
So how many Japanese actually came to the Philippines at that period of
Oh,
Meiji.
and that's where becomes fascinating in the sense that our in official records, um, 30% of the Southeast Asian Japanese population is in the Philippines. However, the problem with it is that this is only the legitimate migration. And that's why I was fascinated in studying the laborers and the Karayuki-san because they will never be registered. Before, in order for you to actually move to a different country, you not only needed a passport, document for them, but you also needed to record, you need to ask permission from the ports and from the government to exit these sites. And what the strategy for the laborers and the strategies for the women was that they would not list themselves, or they would list themselves as barmaids or cafe maids in the ship. So they will never be seen in the manifests that will land. So and that's why it creates this messy idea of counting how many women particular, or how many men, Japanese men were here.
Just the same, just
Yeah.
frame it.
Yeah.
How many Japanese were actually in the Philippines at
Oh.
that period?
Right. The numbers that I know is the ones sa taas, sa Luzon. We roughly had around 30,000. That was already, I mean, if you compare it to South America or the American migration, it's insignificant. But if you compare it to Southeast Asia, 30,000 was big, and only a little less than half for staying in Davao. Yeah. Yes, well.
Your lecture actually opened my eyes to what kind of a Filipino I am. Anyway, 3 points.
Yeah.
I would like to get your affirmation. Number one, the Filipino revolutionaries, of course, did not get official help from the government. But would you confirm that there was support at some level from the private organization? That's one. Number two, very interesting presentation on labor migration from the women. And it is really a shock to me more than anything because there was really no perception of that kind. But is it that kind of history that makes the issue of comfort women a very sensitive issue for the Japanese government? Number three, the skills of the Japanese workers who were building the construction of Cannon Road up to Baguio is still very much acknowledged by the Filipinos who live in that area. I was in Banawe in June, and I would hear stories about their lolos learning so much more from these Japanese workers. I would like to get your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. For the first question, for support, yes, there was support. Actually, the support goes even much deeper. And what we then have to first understand here is the play of politics. Number one, Japan was already in a very careful position. America is there, and you don't want America to sort of control Japan as well. So they could not support it. However, the key here, which is going to be surprising, is Taiwan. A lot of the military support would actually come from the Japanese army that was situated in Taiwan, would then go to the Philippines either as observers, or there were some records. I can't remember their names. There were some records of Japanese that also fought in the revolution, which the Japanese government was not happy with. Only because, if they die, it's the Japanese government's problem. How are we going to repatriate these people? How are you going to explain to the Americans there's a Japanese here, right? But there were several records. The other thing, and the sad thing as well here is, there are also records of revolutionaries not wanting to work with the Japanese that came all the way from Japan to to fight with them. And the reason here is more strategic. The military strategies of the two are quite different. If I'm not mistaken, Meiji followed a British model in their military movement, and that's going to screw up the movements of the guerrillas that were more trained in a different form. So they had a lot of these tips when they were working. I'll work first with the second one. I'll do the third question. For skills, it where there are two concepts that we have to work with here. The first one is the laborers and the women were actually in the Philippines at the same time. But in order to maintain the reputation of the Japanese government, what they needed to do was hide the fact that the Japanese women were here. Because they're engaged in process. It's saving face. So a lot of the descriptions that you know about the skills and so on were actually released from the embassy. Like, we're happy that our excellent laborers are helping in the construction of modernity in the Philippines. So it's really part of that political movement. But aside from that, I've also noticed this is based on observation. Japanese craftsman skills always work small, which means that what you'll then see here is their work is going to be more meticulous because a lot of their craftsmen's work are really small. Their statues are small, their woodcraft is small, even their weaving crafts are quite small. If you then compare it to Philippine crafts, it's not sloppy, but because we like working with big spaces, you also see it with sculptures and so on. We're not meticulous. We just like shift it here and then that's a nose already, right? Something like that. So maybe that can be also part of that concept in terms of skill if we look at it from an aesthetics perspective. From the last point, probably the idea here, it's not just the idea of comfort women, but it's basically the idea of women human trafficking. So the idea here is more the issue of human trafficking, particularly of women. Take note that from a historical lens, and that's why I put as my information here, when were women seen as citizens, right? That's important, and that's actually part of law, right? Unfortunately, a lot of modern, and we've never questioned it even in our own histories, right? We assumed that it happened, but the reality is even in the Philippines, I think suffrage is post-war, right? And it was post-war. So in other words, what we celebrate as an Aguinaldo government, what we celebrate as the independence that was by the Laurel government under Japan, and the post-wars, we can also criticize it as an imperfect concept because it does allow the human trafficking of our women because they were not seen as citizens, right? During that time. So in other words, there was that dangers. These are the gray areas that were there. And that was why when you then look at how labor migration, especially for someone like the Cannon Road Japanese, why they were covered was because they were now seen as Japanese citizens. Right? So it's to me, it's that idea of it's that idea for the women themselves. Us, Jeannie. With comfort women, I actually have a different lecture for that, which will take a longer time. So, but this is that's also a great comparison because what we will also see here is that wherever you go, women's bodies are still being undermined, right? In one way or another. However, a lot of scholars for Karayuki-san tend to look at the Karayuki-san Karayuki-san body as a way for women to have agency. Because remember, they were earning 100, 200 pesos. During that time, oh my God, that's probably around, if that's 19th century, 100, 200 pesos, that's probably around 100,000 pesos right now. And what now becomes interesting for that Father Yuki-san is that they were the people that were now giving money to the men, the laborers. Yes, they're not paid well. Day laborers in the Philippines would be paid 1.5 pesos to 2 pesos. So a month is just 30 pesos. Right? And if they needed to send money for remittances abroad, the people that would loan them money were the women because they had a lot of flexible labor with them. Yeah, yeah,
Can I just,
sure.
just your thoughts, sorry, I'm a
No
woman
problem.
kasi
Yeah.
Um,
No.
um, among the prime ministers that Japan has ever had,
Mm.
will you confirm to me that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had this particular mission to empower women?
Mm.
I think, and I know this for a fact,
Yeah.
he had in his cabinet office
Mm.
a separate section to actually get to know women, especially from Southeast Asia, who had studied in Japan and become successful, with a particular mission to what is the message that you can give to the young Japanese women? Can you confirm if that's really true? Well, I think it is, but among the Japanese prime minister, he was the only one that had this particular voice.
Yes. Well, what I would say is yes. The most visible would be former Prime Minister Abe, because he was moving within that lens. But we also have to look at the engagements in Japanese politics is so messy. Even the different parties that are there, it's the complexities of looking at these politicians. So much so that there was probably work done before Abe, but it was only Abe that had been able to maintain a consensus so that he could then do some of this women's work, right? But if you, well, within our own situation, we are able to then see a lot of this movement, especially in the post-war. Because remember that part of post-war Philippine-Japan relations was reparations and so on, which also includes the issues of comfort women. And they have been active in their engagements within that space, which means that even in the past, it's not as present as we'd like it to be, but at least there was that movement. But yes, Abe was one of the few that had a very visible idea for women.
Okay, any other questions here?
Hi, just a question. So, knowing that, parang hindi naman ganun yung difference ng status ng Japanese and the Philippines way back.
Mm.
What is our fascination with like a savior? Like we were not really looking for real freedom or independence back then. Where could we be coming from?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Wow, very complicated question, but yeah, that's why I guess part of what I wanted to bring to this to this talk is remember when we celebrate the independence, we would always pose it between Rizal versus Bonifacio, right? Where we then look at it as a class war concept. But how I sort of unpack it is that even Bonifacio was elite. And part of the rationale here is that he was influenced by Victor Hugo and Les Miserables. He read Les Miserables in French, and during that time, the only people that were able to be the only people that were literate were the elites. So he was even also constructing this myth of being for the masses, which is a very typical Filipino sort of thing that we're doing, right? So, so where are we now coming from? If we want, so the next question that we then can ask, which is related to your question. So who really wanted independence? And one of the sad things that I'm positing from the limited research that I have right now is it was basically elites that wanted to keep their power in the guise of independence. Because if you then look at our histories and the families are still there, right? Which means that we have now been able to engage in a myth making of our own without really asking what we really need. The only one that probably was true to his word, but is also true to his word, but it's not necessarily noble, is of course we go back to Quezon, who said that I'd rather be run by crap and Filipinos than to be run by the Americans, which tells you about his own sensibilities, because the Quezons are also elite on their own. Okay? So in the end, we can then pose the idea of are we now still independent? Or are we still functioning within these spaces? But we're just maintaining our status quos. Right? But it's something to challenge not only historians but also everyone. Now, where are we in this picture? Because we tend to imagine our liberations. Because like independence, there are three different arguments there. There's the Aguinaldo independence, the often forgotten 1943 independence, right? The 1946 independence, and then we also added to this picture the 86 independence, right? So it's something to think about for us Filipinos. But it's really complicated, but yeah. But thanks for the question.
Okay,
Yeah.
sige. So do we have any other questions from the audience?
It's first of all, I'd like to how do you call that? Well, express thanks to Professor Chua for this lecture. It's not really a question, but how would I say that? Because I've always admired the Meiji Restoration period ever since I studied in Japan. And going back to the title, Aspiring for Meiji Paradise. It doesn't look like a paradise now, actually no. So anyway, to a certain extent, my view of the Meiji Restoration period has changed a bit. Because what I learned and studied and admired is that the Meiji Restoration period, okay, the purpose is really for Japan's industrialization, modernization, westernization. And looking back, the impression that I had was really an admiration for Japan as part of, for example, the G7, right? Of the white Asian powers. No? It's only the non-white Japan representing Asia. So ever since that time, I've always said, oh, Japan is really great. Especially during the League of Nations, before the United Nations, when Japan tried to propose that, the racial clause, racial equality. I mean, considering the whites, and they were the only Asians, right, in the League of Nations, power. The early part of 1900, when they beat it's the first Asian country that beat a Western nation, Russia, no? The Japan rules a war. So, throughout, I've always thought that Japan was really a paradise. But with your lecture, seeing the poverty, and actually in my readings, I've also come across Japanese migrating to South America, Brazil, etc. That's why even Fujimori is a Japanese descendant, right?
Yeah.
Prime Minister of Peru.
Yeah.
And then here in the Philippines, like, you know. So, in other words, what I'd like to say
Yeah.
is that my way of thinking has changed a bit
Mm.
because of the poverty. It's not really
Yeah, yeah.
paradise.
Yeah.
So going back to your title, aspiring for Meiji paradise, doesn't seem to be paradise now. So I want to invite Mahathir said, look east now.
Ah, okay.
So maybe for the industrialization,
Yeah, yeah,
actually that's one of my goals,
yeah,
industrialization nation, the Philippines, which China is doing now. China.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well, that's it. I can go, I can keep on talking like this, but
Yeah.
just to cut it short, just a comment, no?
Yeah.
Focusing on the aspiring for the Meiji paradise.
Okay.
Well, the, you know,
Okay.
negative side too. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Just to rationalize it, actually, because for me, the point is not to, with history, the interesting thing here is that we have to look at the space. Where are we now allowed to say these types of things? And thankfully, well, look at Meiji. It took us 150 years before we could even say something different from the Meiji itself. Why I say that we're aspiring for Meiji paradise, why there's still this aspiration is that I'm not going to go back in time and tell the entrepreneurs no, right? It's also validating that for them, they really truly saw Meiji as a paradise for themselves. However, as a historian, what I wanted to do was to just say, but to see the larger picture in this situation after they did it, what happens? So it's validating that they have an aspiration, but it's also recognizing that past that, Japan went to war. So how do we then put it as part of our stories, as our narratives, right? In the same way that we have these labor migrants that were here, and how do they then build into our Philippine spaces, right? Particularly, and this is sad for the Philippines because we tend to sort of look at ourselves as lesser to a economically superior country. But the reality is, what part of what I wanted to say is we're all normal. We also have problems of our own, and yet we see this place as better than us, and the reality is that we're actually equal. And partly we should pat ourselves a little in the back for all of these things as well. It's sort of playing with those words, and it's also playing with the idea that for us Filipinos, which are now presently a labor-sending country, we all which is this paradise that we're looking at as well, which is this economic escape that we're looking at as well. And that's what sort of Japanese studies for me was the idea of I'm looking at Japan, but I'm also looking at the Philippines. So where are we? Where should we be in this space? But yeah, thanks for the comment.
Okay, so we have another question or comment?
I got it. Yeah, this is not really a question, but it made me even a lot more curious because now that I've learned more about how the first wave of migration from Japan to the Philippines happened, that's during the Meiji period. I'm connecting it now with something that I've been to a particular soap opera that I've been avidly watching quite recently, Ulang Araw. So, and especially in the first few episodes of that, the series portrayed the Japanese living here in the country as friendly people, and being very friendly to Filipinos mismo. But of course, as the story unfolded, parang they were now being portrayed as spies.
Yeah.
Well, of course, that's annoying. For me, it's that part of the story is a lot more nuanced than what was being portrayed in Araw. So, having said that, I was hoping to really learn more about the life of these Japanese migrants during the pre-war era from the 19 from the late 1920s to before the war,
Yeah.
because as that would be like that's during the Taisho period na eh, di ba?
Yeah.
So eto kasi what you were what your lecture is telling us is the conditions that enable these migrations during the Meiji era, and or because of the consequences of the implementation of the Meiji Constitution. So I love to learn more about the aspirations of both the migrants,
Yeah.
vis-a-vis Filipinos versus Japanese.
Mhm.
After the Meiji period,
Yeah.
siguro. Yun yung ano ko, yun yung gusto ko malaman.
Ah,
And also, siguro a quick comment lang. You mentioned there also as well that the Chinese were unreliable during the time that they were building Canada because
yeah.
many of them were addicted to heroin. Is that what you said?
Yes, at least that was what the records of the taskmasters were writing.
I said heroin is missing.
Heroin.
Oh, okay.
We would think it's what's that?
Opium.
Opium, but they say heroin. Parang I didn't want to change what the records showed, but it could be wrong.
Yeah, because heroin was not was not tawag dito. Being sold in the US until after 19.
Yeah.
So it was most likely opium.
Probably opium. Yeah.
It was formulated in the US.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was just I am I'm more interested to learn more about the migration, or kung may mga like another wave of migration from Japan to the Philippines after the Meiji period.
Thanks. Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, yes. There's a lot. That could be research for more people if they wanted to.
Because really, I don't know. The reason why is I kind of feel that as much as the series right now, the series I'm watching, is trying to
Yes.
stick to stick as close to history as possible. I kind of feel that medyo misguided sila. Or it's the picture is really incomplete. So I suppose that would help us further understand why the Japanese were coexisting with the Filipinos just before the war, and then how it suddenly evolved into the story that was now being popularized by that series.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes. Actually, that's why it's nice to have this type of conversation and this type of event. Because just as a thing, I said I took my master's in Singapore, in Japanese studies in Singapore, and the first thing that they actually brought us to is the Japanese cemetery where they buried Karayuki-san. So, and the nice thing about that experience for me was you also see the disparity of the migration that was there, because the tombs of the Karayuki-san are unmarked stones. So it tells you really about their history, the womanhood, their identities. There are no names to them. And beside them are these massive, beautiful stone markers of Japanese that have elite Japanese that have died in Singapore itself. So where am I leading with this? The challenge here is for us to also integrate this as part of our truth telling, our historical telling within our own spaces, right? Kasi in the Philippines, we have all of these people that are here, yet our histories don't integrate them, then talk about them. Right? I mean, we have an American cemetery, we have a German cemetery, we have all of these people that are here, and I think some of the school children, they go to it and they visit it, but they don't also understand the meanings of why these people are here. And these interactions is what makes this community, right? Regardless of what social class they were. And that's part of that challenge then. For me, it was already a challenge to even look at, these labor migrants. And thankfully, because of the meticulousness of Japanese record taking, we were able to see some of it. And we hope that we can see more in the Philippines in these spaces, considering that the articles that I have seen for the Carayupisan, they were one of the first people to actually build the red light district in, I think, in San Palo or in Tondo. So, parang, it becomes this interesting concept na, that's where we probably got the beginnings of that reputation of that place, right? But it's interesting kwento, but you can't push it harder enough unless people get interested in it, and we begin with that. Same thing with Punang Araw. I have my own opinions about it, but it also gives you the idea that our interactions with the Japanese are not limited to just the war, right? We can push it further and further, right? Even to where Japan places their interactions with the Philippines, right? Because in Japanese textbooks in history, especially in grade school, their first interaction with the Philippines is the Luzon Tsubo. The Luzon Pax, which is not even from Luzon. So so the first thing that a lot of Japanese school kids think about the Philippines is this, is it 16th century or 15th century pot? And so they then ask questions like, what is Luzon? Where is Luzon? Luzon is in the Philippines. And it's only Sir Ambet that says that it's not even Philippine pottery because the Luzon Cebu is not, it's too small. Filipinos love big and huge. Right? I think they say that it's Vietnamese that just got traded here and then got retraded. So a lot of those interactions, nahiwala pa tayo dun. We're not yet at that stage. And not a lot of people know about that interaction. So, hopefully more people get interested in it, push it, ask more questions, and then we get a more vibrant history. And as a last point, which is for me, it's I talked to Sir Philip about this as well. Like, it's the frustration in Philippine history. In the last paper that I did, looking at Philippine history, remember that we have 400 years of Spanish colonial, 40 years of American, 3 years of Japanese, and then, and then our independence. If you look at the pages that we allocate for each of this, in the last textbook that I studied, we allocate around 15 to 20 pages for Spanish colonial, 10 for American, and 1 for Japanese occupation. So, it also creates this very sad realities of how imbalanced we are in actually learning about our histories. Yes, it's 400 years, but, so it's also that challenge. Why we know so little? Especially because we painted Japan as just the war. You'd be surprised that you'd like to, and that's why I also brought in the Baguio story here, because you could have hoped that at least the Baguio textbooks would include the Cannon Road narrative to their own thing, but they don't as well because of our nationalist agenda, right? So even regional spaces, Davao cannot also integrate the Davao Japanese into their textbooks. But that's not where the challenge is. Diba? We are an archaeologic nation. We have a national history, but we also have different experiences. So much so that maybe if there are these small spaces that are there, can help. It can enrich our understandings of our small interactions. And this is that small interaction that was able to find. Yeah. Yes.
One last.
Sure.
Confirmation from the historian, and I think we should know this because this man actually has global impact in the world economy.
Yeah.
Can you confirm with me when Japanese government started filling out people in the Meiji during the Meiji era, where they would be educated in the Western, whether it would be Europe or America? There was one man, Eiichi Shibusawa, who, Japanese, Zaibatsu is one. And he comes from a very wealthy family, and I think most of them, he was a samurai. But I'm telling his story because it has taken only now that the Japanese government has acknowledged his contribution but printing his picture in the Ichimayan Satsu. And the Japanese government said, well, when he was telling this to the great grandson who's still alive, who turned not 100 years old but is still, fit, that it is not so easy to have something like that in a Japanese yen. No, because it's going to be distributed globally and the impact is very different. And that's why they had to go through a lot of security measures. But I think he's just one example of how he has influenced the economy, not just in the Philippines, but the world through the Zaibatsu concept. Of course, there's capitalism, but what a great contribution. I think he schooled in Britain and in America, but he managed to bring President Wilson to Japan because he was more attracted to the American economics than the British, but there was still some kind of British influence. And I'm sure you encountered him in your research. Your thoughts on this, please?
Thanks. Yes, modernity has always been about looking for spaces for education, which is sort of related to the nantok, right? In the sense that countries would then send students with potential to wherever they needed to go. But one thing that we don't realize is, remember at the time when the Nantoku students were sent to Japan. This was a time when Japan was popular, but not also popular at the same time. In other words, you'd rather go to the US, the UK, but that's also where you see this openness in these places. You learn where you can learn. There is potential. So with Japan, Shizuoka was sent or went, depending on how you work with the story, based on his specialty. In the same way that there were other scholars, people with potential that were sent to different countries as well. So in the end, what you then have is when they come back, they are now able to run a country or run a government in a way that they're going to get the knowledge that they got from where they went. The same thing happened with the non-Toku, who are now interacting with people that were also sent to the US, that were sent to the UK. So and that's also something that when I was reading Gary's book, it was something that was important. But just to sort of push to parang nilibenta natin dito ni Gary, is that it's also part of the political economy that was there. If Gary wrote this probably 50 years before, people would not be happy with it, right? But it's also the political economies of the histories now that we're now at a space where we are able to look to the Nantoku and not label them as what Philip and I were talking about, as collaborators, diba? Anything earlier than that, we could have been functioning under these very simplistic labelings that were there, but now we're able to actually contextualize these people, right? Same thing with the Karayuki-san. We would have labeled them as prostitutes and just ended with that. But now we're in a space where we're able to actually talk about them and humanize them. Right? Same thing with the laborers. So it's the unfortunateness of how history is, where you just need longer time. The historical patience is necessary for things to actually talk about. And the last point there is the sad realities of how, for the Philippines, and I think Sir Rico was actually fighting this, where we changed the personalities in our 1,000 peso bill. Yeah, let's remember that our 1,000 peso bill, the personalities that were there were World War II personalities, right? They were significant, and that was part of the reason why Sir Rico was really up in arms with it, right? So it's the erasure of a banal form of our histories with that, and I think we replaced it with Philippine Eagle. Yeah, which was also vetted. So you also see here the importance of histories in these spaces and how we're supposed to work with it. So yes, Shiozawa in the new bill, yeah, will then ask this question, who this person is, and it then engages into that interaction. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we're having a very interesting discussion, but
Yeah.
all those things must come to an end.
Yes.
And, yeah, so let's, give a big warm round of applause for everyone. Thank you very much. Carl. Yeah, and also I'd like to acknowledge our online participants. There were as many as 41 during the lecture. It's now 23. Yeah, thank you very much for joining. Maraming salamat. Arigatou gozaimasu. So now, food. Yeah, food, but before you go to the back, may I request the on-site participants to please fill in the survey questionnaire. It will be very useful for us for